All right, so we're going to start our vector project today. This is assignment 6, and it's a vector logo mashup. And what I mean by that is we can be creative and we can take things that already exist and make our own versions of them. And we want it to work kind of like a logo. And logos tend to be very simple, one color, often black on white. We want to play with this idea of it being our own creative expression and putting two things together, or more than two things together, to communicate our own original message. So as a very simple example, this Playboy bunny put with IHOP. This is the IHOP logo type. A logo type is a logo that uses the letters. And then a straight logo is just a graphic symbol like the Playboy bunny here. Now, when you search for a vector on the computer, you won't actually get a vector because the computer is made up of pixels, and online it can only remember pixels. So this looks pretty terrible. But if I take this and I save it as a JPEG onto my desktop as a raster image, and then I take it into a program that makes vectors, which is really the only way you can see vectors, is through programs that are able to view them. And our program that we're going to use is Adobe Illustrator Ai. So I'm going to open that program up. Just to get introduced to Illustrator. This is our introduction. At first, it looks a whole lot like Photoshop. But when I open a file, so let's say I open this JPEG, I'm going to open it with Illustrator. It's going to open up the JPEG, but it does something weird. First of all, it puts it into a larger rectangle. And this is basically how it would print. But this larger rectangle doesn't matter at all. It only matters when you print, because vectors don't have resolution. So right now, this isn't a vector. This is a JPEG. And so when I click on it, it just draws a box around the whole thing. And then it gives me what are called tracing options. And so if you go up to image trace, which used to be live trace, and I click on the presets, we can choose how we want it to draw. So I'm going to say silhouettes. Right? And now, if I like that preview, I can hit expand, and now it is a vector. Because this is what vectors look like. They are not pixels, they are instead what are called anchor points. And between each anchor point, you have a line or a curve. And you can change those curves by using what are called the Bezier handles. And I can change that bunny's head into any kind of weird shape I want. Right? And all the fonts that we use, all the different letter types that we use, are all vectors. And so to customize a letter form, you don't do it as pixels. You do it as vectors because they're more versatile. And you can drag them around, right? The only shapes here are these black shapes. They're like cut out of paper. So if I go to my layer view, which is always handy, there's only one layer, but within that layer are all the different paths. And I can select them either this way or with my selection tools. The black arrow is what's called the large selection tool. So it will select everything in that group. This is also how, like free transform in Photoshop, I can scale or rotate or otherwise distort my shapes. But they're all individual paths. So if I want to select an individual path, I can click it here under the grouping, Or I can use what's called the small selection tool and just select each shape that way. And then the white arrow, the small selection tool, also allows me to select individual anchor points. And once they're selected, I can modify them and drag them around, or even just take their handles. Whoops. Let me get the anchor point. Take their handles and modify them. So it's a way of just kind of cutting out shapes that are always perfectly smooth, no matter how much you zoom in. They'll always match the resolution of whatever the media is, whether it's a screen or whether it's a print resolution on a certain printer. We also have a history that we can use. And because Illustrator takes so little memory, if you just hit Command Z, you can just, like in other programs other than Photoshop, you can just keep hitting Command Z and go as many steps back as you want. So I can go all the way back to before I trace the vector. Now what if I wanted to trace a better vector? So I go to Image Trace, I say Silhouettes, and it shows me that. But now I want to play with the different options. So instead of it tracing as black and white and filling in all my shapes, I can say I want it to trace only the outlines. Like that. And now I just have a path. Now why might I want to do that? Okay, if I hit Expand now, and it just traces the outlines, then I can say, the large selection tool, let's select it all, that I want it only to not fill in the path, but rather just give it an outline, what's called a stroke. And with that stroke, I can do a lot of different things. I can give that stroke a different color. But you have to tell the computer that you want it to support the color. So I'll usually just do the regular print profile with a new document, because when we traced it as black and white, it didn't support color. So now if I select this and copy it, and then go to the new print format, now it will support color if I want it to. There we go. First I have to select it, and then I have to replace the color. So it's not very intuitive, and it takes some getting used to. But now I'm able to do a lot of different things with these shapes. So I can take this bunny head outline, first select it as an individual path. You can also draw boxes around it. You can also see that in layers. So it's just one path on this grouping, this path here. And I can use an outline, and I can actually vary that outline from being uniform to being weird, from being small to being thick. I can go from thick to thin or thin to thick. I like this one quite a bit. It just is trying to simulate kind of the pressure of a brush. All these different variations. And then uniform is just a technical line that, like with fonts, you just set not with a pixel width, but with a point width. And then you can even get, in these new versions of Illustrator, charcoal's a lot of fun to work with, different versions of stroke outlines. You can do it with an oval brush, with a flat brush, on and on and on. And you can even do these more kind of decorative borders. And even lower opacity. And then you can even bring in different textures that are JPEGs, and it will map it to it. So there's lots of versatility. It's kind of getting away from understanding the basics. So the outline is this. It's called the stroke. And then the other option is what's called the fill. And right now we have nothing inside this shape, so it has a red bar through it. But if I want to fill it, I can fill it with a color, and I can pick that color. Or I can fill it with a gradient, and I can pick that gradient. Right? And that gradient can be linear or radial. And that gradient can be added to. And that gradient can even be colored. Right? And I can add as many colors to this as I want. And then I can even play with the transparency and the opacity of that. And even under the gradient, I can say, okay, instead of going to black at the edges, I want it to go to 0% opacity at the edges, which basically means it's not there at the edges. You can try different aspect ratios of your gradient, different angles. Just lots and lots of options. So now this is actually all still on the same path. It's all on this path. But I can turn the stroke off if I want and just leave the gradient fill. So many options. I can also copy and paste layers. So if I want to do another version of this shape, I can simply copy paste. So edit copy, edit paste, but we have more options than just paste. We have paste in front, paste in back, paste in place. And I always say paste in place because that's like duplicate. So now we have it up here. And now on this layer, which looks the same, I'm going to fill it with red, let's say, at 100% opacity. You can see how I can layer those up. And then I'll put that 100% opaque cutout path behind the other one I did. So lots of options. And then if I want, I can move this one and get kind of a drop shadow offset. So many things you can do. All right. When you are bringing in a JPEG, so let me go back in time here, back to this step. You can also pick the threshold. So if I do a preset and I want to do, let's say, silhouette again, but I want the little eye to show up, I just want to reduce the threshold of what it considers black or white. And no matter what I do here on threshold, it doesn't want to give me that white eye. So how would I add that in? Let's say I liked this. I'm going to say expand. These are the shapes I like. It's a better shape. I want to add a white shape. The way I usually do it is I make a new layer. And we, just like in Photoshop with our exercise, we can use shape tools. And I'm going to use the ellipse tool, hold down Shift, and get a perfect circle, and then I'm going to fill that circle in with white. I usually say only web colors to keep it simple to start with. And then I don't want it to have a stroke. Now it's easy to make shapes, it's harder to control them and organize them. So that's what we're going to work on next. But using the trace tools, honestly, it works best when you're tracing images that are just black and white. If I bring in a color JPEG, it kind of makes a mess of it. Maybe we'll show